kind of ironic that everyone wants to go and listen to the really power-hungry, hardware-hungry topic of the day rather than talk about how we can tread more lightly.
Hello everyone, welcome to Green.io with Gael Duez. That's me. Green.io is a podcast for responsible technologists building a greener digital world, one bite at a time. Every 2 Tuesdays, our guests from across the globe share insights, tools, and alternative approaches, enabling people within the tech sector and beyond to boost digital sustainability. Because accessible and transparent information is in the DNA of Green.io, all the references mentioned in this episode, as well as the transcript, will be in the show notes, both on your podcast platform and on our website, greenio.tech. Today, we're going to talk about a relationship. A deep, pivotal, and yet troubled relationship. Open source and IT sustainability. Every person I talk in our sustainability field takes it as a no-brainer. Open source is good for sustainability. But which open source are we talking about? And is this correlation so strong? For instance, is an open source software always more frugal or sustainable in the way it is designed? We don't know. Let's investigate it. But there is at least one thing which is certain. Open source software is big. A recent post made by Sasha Lucioni, one of my absolute favorite thought leaders in AI, caught my eye. A recent HBS study found that companies would have to spend 3.5 times more on their software development if open source were not around. And we're talking about an $8.8 billion estimated market. So open source is big. Let's see how it connects with sustainability. Today, I'm delighted to have two guests to talk about sustainability who has done open sources from the trenches. Oliver Cronk is a fellow YouTuber. Now I can say, because yes, Green.io has launched its YouTube channel a week ago to offer a wider choice for accessing its content than, traditional podcast platforms like Apple or Spotify. Anyway, Olivier is the Architect Tomorrow host, a channel for enterprise and platform architects with a soft spot for sustainability, among other topics. He's also a tech strategist at ScottLogic, a software and data consultancy based in the UK, and has a significant track record in both IT and energy. As an example, he built carbon calculators, air quality databases, and industrial emissions reporting systems, which made him experience firsthand the issue of accessing open, transparent, and reliable data. Kate is a software engineer with a master's degree, so not easy to mess with her when it comes to data and statistics, and she is a driving force in this sustainable technology practice at ScottLogic, especially involved in the recent release of the Technology Carbon Standard at Open UK several weeks ago, a standard under Creative Commons license, of course. By the way, they will present it at Green.io London on September 19th this year, but that's a different story. Welcome, Olivier. Thanks a lot for joining Green.io today. So are you on your bike or more comfortably sitting at your desk?
No, today I'm stationary. I'm at my desk. Thanks for having us, Gael.
You're welcome. That's nice to have you on the show. And welcome, Katie. Thanks a lot for joining Green.io today as well. Maybe first question will be for you with your academic track record. When we talk about open source, it can actually cover a lot of different angles. Could you give us your definition or your way of approaching what is open source?
Of course. So when I think about open source, I always think about open source software. So this is software whose source code is sort of freely available to modify, to distribute, deploy, even extend it into their own projects. So I think one of the key parts of open source is that it's transparent. You can view methodology behind the code. There's also other types of open source, which I think maybe Oliver could expand on.
Yeah, no, happy to. So I think you've touched on open data, which is an important one, but then open hardware is really interesting as well when it comes to sustainability. So at the Open UK conference you mentioned, Gael, there was a great presentation about open compute, the open hardware sort of initiatives to ensure that there are sort of standards for hardware. And there are companies now taking the used hardware out of the big hyperscaler data centers and reusing it because it still has a life, right? The big hyperscalers no longer want it, but you can easily get additional life out of it by hosting it in another data center and getting other people to run workloads on it. So there's a whole host of different strands of the open source kind of ecosystem, really. software, hardware, data, significant ones.
I think that would be a good way to define these pillars of data, software, and hardware. So, Olivier, you started with hardware, not maybe the most obvious when we are in the IT world. What are the progress today that you've seen in open source hardware?
Yeah, I'd love to throw to Katie to talk about the sort of data that's available, hopefully in the future in more of an open form about hardware. But in terms of hardware itself, I think there's some really interesting developments. Like I talked about the Open Compute project, they have a whole sustainability division that's looking at the circularity of the hardware. And I think having open standards when it comes to hardware is really, really important, because otherwise it's the compatibility challenge, right? If everyone is inventing their hardware to kind of be unique and proprietary, it just means we have a whole lot of potentially wasted components that won't work with other systems. And we're producing lots of different types of components that only work with one particular platform. So I'm a really big proponent of the Open Compute project, also because they're looking at things like, can we increase the ambient temperature of data centers, for example, to reduce their cooling requirements and things like that. So they're doing some really clever stuff in that area. But I think also open hardware is interesting when you look at the sort of hardware hacker sort of culture that's created as well, right? What can you run on a embedded device like a Raspberry Pi? How can we extract every last efficiency out of a watt, a couple of watts that a Raspberry Pi runs on. So I think there's some really interesting sort of things that come out, the constraints that you impose when you look at sort of consumer grade hardware and the open source movements around that.
Yeah, and just to not close, but to comment on the hardware topic, it really resonates with the new battle of my good friend Tristan Nito, who's one of the founder actually of Mozilla Europe. So he's been in the game for quite a while, and he's got his amazing talk now that he's given several conferences already about Moore's law is dead. Now it's eROM. So that's kind of reversing the Moore name. And the idea is every year you don't double the size of your computing power. Every year you divide by 2 the size of your code. So that every year you are able to run your code on lighter and lighter machine, which means older and older machine, which means saving potentially millions, avoiding building new computers that actually don't need. But anyway, Katie, you wanted to elaborate a bit more on the data side. I think this is one of your main battle, isn't it?
Yeah, so especially with sort of manufacturers of hardware, the data they provide themselves, often the figures they give in these, it's not clear on how they actually calculate them. So for example, if you wanted to find out like the typical energy consumption, they might provide this figure, but it's hard to find out where they're getting this from, like how long are they running the device to arrive at this figure. Additionally, there's other sort of documentation that these manufacturers provide, like product carbon footprint, which gives like the emissions from each use stage of the life cycle. So manufacture, transportation, usage, end of life. But again, it's just not clear how they get these figures. So the benefit of open source is having that methodology transparent to everyone to see how these figures are arrived at.
Yeah, the big issue if you've got a quite diverse hardware estate is that we might add Apple and Orange because the way one manufacturer would calculate things is not the same one than the others. And eventually, these numbers don't make sense at all. What do you see as a potential path to overcome this very big difficulty in data sustainability?
Well, I think open source is key. Just having a sort of level playing field for the methodology that we use to calculate these things. So, I think we'll probably discuss it later, but like tools like cloud carbon footprint, sort of having that methodology that you can use across cloud providers. So it's more comparable, easier to track your improvements across the estate. And that's just one part of the standards.
Katie's touched on a really important point there, which is at the moment, because the manufacturers can essentially almost make up, I'm exaggerating a little bit to make a point, but because they can almost make up their methodology, their numbers, it almost becomes a marketing exercise to make it look like their product consumes less energy. And it's a bit of a game, right? So if you come up with a really creative way of measuring the power consumption of your device, we've seen servers, for example, with different sort of load ratings, and energy consumption, different load ratings. And each manufacturer seems to sort of measure at a different load. So some are at 20%, some are at 80%, some are at 100%. It's like, okay, well, you can make yourself look cleaner by just presenting the characteristic that your model of hardware tends to perform best at. And of course, then you don't really know whether you're making an improvement or you've just bought better marketing. when you change suppliers. So that I think that's why what Katie's saying is really important. Like this apples for apples comparison is super important because we already have the same with cloud. Like you run AWS's cloud carbon tooling versus Azure's versus Google's. They all have different methodologies, and so they're not comparable.
And that's the point with carbon footprint. And I'm very happy you raised, both of you actually, you raised the point, is that true, it's a very powerful tool. Cameron was on the show last year. I'm a big advocate of CCF among other open source tools. But at the end of the day, they have to recalculate things that should be provided by hyperscalers. And I think here we've got two very serious issues. The first one is the methodology. Tools like open source tools like Boa Vista, Cloud Scanner, or CCF. Obviously, the methodology is transparent, so at least we know how they manipulate the data. But then there is the issue of the data itself. I mean, do we have the granularity to calculate things in a wise enough way? And I'm not always sure, because for cloud, but Katie, I will let you elaborate on it. For cloud, it's always a question of transforming financial data, almost all the time, financial data into sustainability data. And some data would be more, I would say, accurate, like starting with CPU usage or GPU usage or whatever. But what's your thought on it, Katie?
So with regard to cloud, one of the key issues is that each cloud provider, they have their own tooling, but the methodology is not the same. So I think one of the main challenges is to do with sort of greenhouse gas scopes. So I think AWS especially, they don't include scope 3. I think that's one of the benefits of the Cloud Carbon Footprint tool, is that it provides a way to at least try and estimate that proportion allocating to scope 3 and sort of compare on the same level with those from like Google, Azure. I think Google does provide data on scope 3 emissions. So I think it's sort of just picking the right methodology for your estate. So for example, if you just had Google Cloud, maybe you just go with their tool since it's probably more up to date and includes scope 3. Whereas if you had multi-cloud or AWS, you might want to look at a tool like Cloud Carbon Footprint.
But I think the point, Gael, around using financial numbers to come up with sustainability metrics is an interesting one. And clearly it'd be great if we could trust the native tool, like Katie said, like use the Google tool, the AWS tool, because they have access to the underlying data that allow them to more accurately calculate the emissions. The trouble is there's a trust thing there, isn't there? I think it's how transparent are they being, and how much do we trust them to kind of calculate this in a fair way, rather than just putting forward, a polished view of their emissions, a managed kind of view of their emissions rather than reality. And so this is where I think the open approaches really would help, because if they were open and transparent about what went into providing the service that you pay for, you would be able to make a more informed decision. And I think the calculations would be far more robust than basing them just on billing data. Ideally, you find situations where you save money and you save carbon, but those two aren't necessarily going to go hand in hand in all cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the issue with a client very recently when we made the calculation that the bill will go up by 20%. And then you have also the question of how do you calculate a clean energy region? Because I don't know if you've seen this beautiful post from Mark Butcher migrating from Scotland to Ireland, where almost a times 6 difference in carbon intensity of the electricity grid. Actually, if you do very basic math, you will still double your carbon footprint. Still, I would like to go back to, okay, so we claim that open source and open data, because we are 100% on this open data subpart of open source here, should be there. But the question is, why not? One of the pushback I've heard from hyperscaler representatives is like the business secrets, and that they don't want to share because it's sensitive data. But what your thought on it, and do you believe there are all other obstacles, I would say, on the road toward more transparency, or at least from the data perspective?
I think that sort of garden data for a commercial reason, especially with regards to sustainability, it's just not really the way forward. I think to sort of make sustainable software key and forefront, we really need to be transparent so people can build on the methodology. It's not really any good sort of reinventing the wheel when there's already so many good established data points, methodologies out there. I think as well, open source projects, they have such a large user base, especially compared to some like enterprise softwares, especially internal sort of company softwares. Not always, but sometimes. So I think any efficiency gains that we make to open source software can have a real downstream impact.
Yeah, Katie's kind of moved on to one of the other key kind of conversation points we have around open source, right? But before we go there, my take on what you're saying, I think the commercial pushback is an interesting one, and I'm not convinced it's as simple as if we just reveal some more data, all of a sudden the cat is out the bag and everyone will know how we're running our data center. I think the reality is running a modern data center, certainly for a hyperscaler, is super, super complex, right? And they're even using AI to optimize them. Like Google and Meta, for example, have used AI, right, to optimize their cooling and stuff like that. So I think that if you just release some data about your energy consumption and your, the high level waste footprint and water footprint and all that sort of stuff, that's going to be commercially disadvantageous if you release that information, maybe to a point, because it will reveal perhaps to your competitors how efficiently you're running things. But yeah, I think it's just an excuse that they're hiding behind, quite frankly. And I guess I think what will happen if they continue to drag their feet is the EU will regulate. And I think the EU is already regulating, right? If you look at the data center regulation that's coming out, if you're running a data center over a certain power consumption now or in the near future, you will have to start reporting on more data. So I think that the reality is if companies continue to drag their heels on being transparent, regulation will follow. And it's probably better to kind of get ahead of that.
Yeah, you're mentioning the energy efficiency directive. And I will put the link in the show notes as everything that we've discussed so far. But is it the only way forward? It's okay to regulate. I'm a big advocate of better norms and more transparency. But do you believe this is the only trigger that will force like big actors to become more transparent? Is there any other way?
I think Google have shown that this can be a competitive edge, right? I think pretty sure that Google are still the only ones that give you near real-time carbon intensity information of the different regions that they operate in. Why are Google doing that? In my view, they're doing that because they are probably still number 3 in terms of enterprise cloud adoption. Like it's AWS and Azure, depending on which stats you look at, are the leading 2, right? Google is still trying to compete. So in order to compete, I think they are offering more transparency. They're offering more options around sustainability than the other 2 are, arguably. And so I think this can be a competitive edge. I do wonder whether, if Google went a bit further in the near future, the EU companies might all of a sudden go, do you know what, we're just going to adopt Google Cloud because they just give us the data we need for regulatory compliance, for example. So I think the regulatory lever can be really powerful, but you're right, it probably can be too big a stick at times when actually industries can get ahead of that by just saying, do you know what, we'll just be a bit more transparent, a bit more open, a bit more sensible and pragmatic about how we operate. And then that way the regulators won't have to force this out of us.
I think it's pretty obvious that the European Union has I don't remember who coined the word, but I really love it, the long arm of EU regulations, and that you also see in California, etc. That when the EU regulate, actually it doesn't stop at the European border and it goes pretty much everywhere in the world, as we've seen with the privacy laws. First, European Union is not as powerful, economically speaking, as it used to be, even it's still a very, very big market, obviously. But what about the UK? Because you're both based in the UK. The UK is not a European Union member anymore. But on this specific aspect, do you think that whenever the European Union regulates, somehow it will lead the UK to adopt a similar pattern, or is it a different way of doing things in the UK now?
So I think the reality is, as much as the UK thinks it's left the European Union, the reality is we still live in Europe, and Europe is one of our biggest trading partners. And so therefore, whatever Europe does, we'll almost certainly have to follow in some regard. So I think, we haven't abandoned GDPR, for example. We still have that, in our law, a very similar law to that. And I think it's a matter of how much do we want to sort of stay in harmony with our biggest trading partner or not. And I think we've got political changes probably happening, in the next few months for the UK, and it will be interesting to see quite what happens there.
Regarding the link that you made between, kind of transparency competition, I would say, on one hand, and regulation on the other, I think it's a very interesting point that one will lead the other. Do you believe that, except maybe for Google, there are other cases where transparency could become a competing advantage?
I definitely think hardware, like the end user hardware, I honestly think if there are organizations that are being far more transparent about the supply chain and the kind of full life cycle analysis of their products, and they do that in a way that you don't have to fight through PDFs and extract information from data sheets, but actually they perhaps provide an API or an open standard or something where you can just get that information, I think that fairly soon will be a competitive advantage. And so I think the first organizations that do that will win. I also look at companies like Fairphone that are, that are more modular and repairable, with the Right to Repair Act that the EU has also just put out. I honestly think that there is scope for innovation in repairability, and it will be really interesting to see, for example, how Apple responds to that regulation, and do they do it to the minimum, or do they go beyond and be more transparent about supply chain and so on at the same time? I think that would be amazing if someone chooses to innovate on that angle, and I think they would find a lot of success in that space, in all honesty.
We'll see. I think some kind of pattern usually with Apple is like they pour tens of millions of dollars in lobbying against, then they drag their feet a bit, and then when everyone starts to follow, they put $10 million on moving forward and then claiming they're the best. And I simply don't understand why they don't skip the two first part of the dance. But that's a different story. So we talked a lot about hardware, data transparency, methodology transparency. But Katy, you mentioned before the correlation, not that obvious correlation between open source software and sustainability. And please, could you elaborate a bit on it?
Yeah, of course. So as I was saying, open source projects can often be adopted widely by many organisations and can also be extended or used in their own projects. So I think due to this scale, sort of any efficiency gains or sustainability improvements that are made to the code can have a real impact downstream, so like a ripple effect. What might seem like quite a small optimization, like in the core code base, can have massive impacts downstream on the community. So sort of reduce the environmental impact across the ecosystem. Baking in these sustainable practices into the actual open source code. In the same way sort of other non-functional requirements like security are already in, it would be hugely beneficial, something that we're missing at the moment.
Do you have some examples of maybe communities, open source community on a dedicated software starting to pay attention to that, or is it way too early stage at the moment?
I think it's pretty early, right? But the comparison I would make to this is a bit like when you buy your laptop. What power profile does it ship with, right? Does it ship with the high performance profile enabled by default, or the power saving profile enabled by default? And I would encourage all open source software contributors and maintainers to think about that same sort of thing. When someone downloads your software or includes their library in their software, what mode is it running in by default? And does someone have to specifically go and tune it for either efficiency or for performance or for security? Because like for security now, it's pretty frowned upon, right? If you ship your open source software in a way that's unsecure by default. And I would say that, like Katy was saying, like encouraging us to think about our open source projects and making them run in an efficient way by default. And maybe if you really need to crank the performance out of it, then yeah, you go and tune and you go and make optimizations. But that is something I think that could have a massive impact. And Katy's right, the scale at which open source libraries and software are deployed means that any savings that we make there are going to massively outweigh perhaps any optimizations we might make on our enterprise code. So yeah, we do a lot of work with big government and big financial services customers, but even still, internal applications for them are hundreds of users, maybe thousands of users. They're not the millions of users that open source projects have. So where do you focus your optimization efforts as an open source developer? Do you optimize your own code that's running on your own, company systems, or do you optimize open source? So I would say, as far as coding efficiency goes, think about what code you're optimizing.
And especially knowing that we have only to target like 5% of open source developers, because it's like 5-10% contribute to almost 99% of the code base. So we can target very active developers. My question would be, is a bit different. As an end user, like obviously a developer, but downloading some kind of libraries, whatever, etc. Do I have today all the information? And honestly, the answer is no. So I'm kind of self-answering my question. But what would it require to be able to understand, okay, this is kind of a frugally designed or low carbon open source code? I mean, there is nothing I'm pretty sure like 99.99% of the MD in GitHub or any other repository, they don't mention the carbon footprint at all or any kind of environmental approach. There is this project, I'm kind of thinking out loud at the moment, but is the impact framework provided by the Green Software Foundation the right approach, or any other tools could be used or leveraged to access this information? What do you think about this?
I think the impact framework shows potential to have a standardized way of calculating things. It's very early, and we're excited. We're going to be part of Carbon Hack this year, and that's all about the impact engine framework. And we're going to be, for example, probably looking at how you measure S3, the impact of S3, the Amazon S3 service using impact framework. I think what we need, though, is more of a standard. And you've perhaps given me a bit of an idea here of where the tech carbon standard that we launched recently could go, right? I mean, we've primarily designed it as a way of navigating the technology space and working out where your emissions live in the upstream, operational, and downstream sort of categories that we've sort of touched on throughout this episode. But actually, I do wonder whether there is almost a metric that you should be looking for in each of those. And I think we're signposting open source tools and standards, but I do wonder if ultimately that might be where we lead, is giving people an easy, almost like a eco label for software, or a bit like the calorie counting you get on food, right? We need something as simple as that for someone to go red, amber, green on a library or, a piece of software. We're not there yet, but I hope we get there.
Yeah, I think that was the idea behind the API Green Score, main French companies. It's an open source approach as well, but it's more like a best practices checklist. Like, okay, is my API management clean? Do I provide information on carbon, etc.? And then you've got a score. I kind of like this approach. It's very straightforward. Still, it requires pretty transparent methodology and data to be sure that we compare apple with apple once again. I'm really about fruit salad. Cathy, as a developer, because you are, what would you like to have when you use open source code to make sure that you're using a very efficient one?
I think the idea that you discussed, Oliver, was really quite a good one about sort of the comparisons to a calorie counter. I think having that sort of metric, just so when you're looking and researching what you actually want to use in your code, you don't really have to dig in too much. That would be really useful if you could just see high level what sort of sustainability level is this library got, for example. And for a developer, you want to be looking at how you can code. So I think learning from how upstream dependencies, open source libraries have been coding efficiently is a really good way to learn.
I think that exemplar approach is really interesting. It would be nice to see, those sort of standards sort of applied. And I think in most cases they are. That you could argue they are, right? Because lots of open source libraries have been optimized for performance, which means they should be fairly efficient. But that's a big assumption, right? And so I think what we're talking about here is something that validates that and ensures that that there isn't excessive memory usage or excessive CPU consumption, perhaps polling, anti-patterns. So I think maybe we aren't that far away from maybe being able to take some of the Green Software Foundation principles and standards and patterns and maybe running some tests. Because that's the other part of this. We talk a lot about coding, but the testing is really important as well. And so we're equally looking at other software development lifecycle roles like testing to say, should there be a test suite for efficiency, for energy consumption of code? So part of your pipeline, your builds break if energy consumption is over a certain level or efficiency is not hitting the bar. So this is the sort of bigger picture software development lifecycle thinking we're also doing. Beyond just sort of classifying emissions into their different buckets, it's also thinking about how does each role play its part when it comes to building more sustainable software.
I'm very enthusiastic about what you describe, and actually I know that there are a few projects in CI/CD pipeline trying to automate it. So full disclosure, I've launched a project with my good friend Benoit Petit at the Boa Vista Association, but that's not public yet, but we've released the version 0 of our repository of green IT tools, because we want to increase the transparency in the landscape. So the idea is not to assess if the tool is good or bad, but just to assess how transparent is the methodology, the data used, and all the information that will help people choose the right tool. And that's something that I will talk a bit more at Green.io Singapore and in forthcoming podcasts. It's really a transparency battle. It's not an quality assessment battle. And a good practical exercise to close the podcast. How would you launch this open source initiative? if you launch it?
Well, we'd certainly come back on the podcast if you have us. Katie, what are your thoughts? You're more in the development world than I am these days.
I think in the sort of same ways, projects like Green Software Foundation, I think sort of Copilot tool it's the same sort of thing. It's to the way that Green Software Foundation have sort of promoted their principles and their green coding patterns, sort of promote the tool in the same way.
But when you launch an open source project, I mean, you have an idea, you want to launch, obviously you will create a GitHub repository and, the license, blah, 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 etc. Okay, but hey, you're still 2 or 3 of you. Okay, I don't know how many people. Actually, how many people will join from Scott Logic for that kind of project? Will it be only the 2 of you?
We have a team of about 10 people working in this space at the moment, but people have rotated in and rotated out as we've got a consultancy, right? So when we have client projects, people will go on to client work. So it very much depends on, what client projects are going on at any one time as to how many people are involved in our R&D initiatives. But ultimately, we're rolling out sustainable software thinking across the whole of the company, and that's about 500 people in total, about 450 or so consultants. Not all of those are developers, of course, but this mindset and these best practices are being pushed out across the organization, because we don't want this to be a bolt-on. We want this to be how we just work by default, back to the sensible defaults thing. So I think, if launching it, we'd almost certainly launch it internally. We'd alpha test it ourselves, and then I think we would look to kind of work with friendly clients, and then kind of use open source ecosystems we're part of, like Linux Foundation and Finos. So shout out to Finos that we do a lot of work with. They're a great organization for financial services open source adoption. So I think it's kind of use the community, right? I think would be the straightforward answer to that one, because that's the beauty of the open source effort, right? Is it's always community driven. So kind of embrace that community approach.
And does it respond well, the community, to that kind of project?
Well, it's interesting, right? My presentation at Open UK, I would have hoped for a slightly larger audience, but I was competing with AI. There's a lot of AI talks, and everyone, I think if you put an AI talk on, everyone wants to go to that talk right now because it's just so hot. And so it's kind of ironic that everyone wants to go and listen to the really power-hungry, hardware-hungry topic of the day rather than talk about how we can tread more lightly. I do fear there is a culture war, Gael, happening. Like some of the tech meetups I've been going to recently, there's almost 2 camps. There's people that are almost falling for the techno-optimist manifesto from Mark Andreessen Horowitz and just think growth and energy consumption and increasing energy consumption isn't a problem. And there are others who are more aware of the issues. We don't have endless power sources that are renewable, sadly. I'm living a Jekyll and Hyde personality day by day at the moment, right, Gael, because I am spending almost equal amounts of time on AI R&D and sustainability R&D. But I do struggle with this. And in fact, I've got a blog in drafts that I'm not sure I'll publish, but it's sort of talking about this conflict I have between technological progress using AI and then on the other hand, all the power consumption and the sustainability impacts that will have. So I do have this sort of schisms in should we be embracing this thing or should we be being more cautious? It's a really fascinating time, I think, to be a technologist right now. Like the different challenges and opportunities that we have in front of us. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you, and I think actually it's also a good thing not to be made in one piece of wood, I would say. And because our world is complex, it requires subtlety, and even if it's not very comfortable, coming with subtle approaches of the big questions that we have, and not having like one single answer for every question, I think it's a good approach. Whether it's AI or I don't know how to say it, but kill the tech or whatever approach, or go back to Stone Age. I don't know. I don't want to use it as a caricature, but you see my point. It is we're thinking complex, and it's very uncomfortable because I think we are more and more aware of how complex is the world we live in, and that's just us adapting to the reality of our world. So quite a lot has been covered here. To close the podcast, as usual, I would love both of you to share one piece of good news, sustainably related, even being related, but sustainably at large is cool. Something that make you happy about our path towards a more sustainable world, I would say.
I think for me, because I'm quite new to the tech space, especially the technology sustainability space, I think just seeing the community growing, it's really positive. seeing all of the initiatives that are out there, whether they're open source. I think just like seeing the work that our team's been doing as well, the Tech Carbon Standard, I think it's all really positive. It's going in the right direction.
I'm going to choose something that's not tech, but it's energy. So I'm probably as much an energy nerd as I am a technology nerd. And the thing that really excited me the other day was the announcement of quite a big electricity interconnect between Denmark and the UK, right? And this I hadn't heard about this, but a huge investment, like we're talking billions of pounds or euros investment to create this undersea link between Denmark and the UK. And it makes a lot of sense because both Denmark and the UK have a lot of wind power. And because of the time difference between Denmark and the UK, our peak electricity demands are at a different time. So there's a lot of sense in this interconnect because when it's windy in Denmark and there's lots of demand in the UK, they can send their wind power to the UK and vice versa. And so I didn't know this thing was even being built, and it's gone live literally in the last couple of weeks. And it's significant. Like I think it's like at least a gigawatt of interconnect. So a serious DC power interconnect between the two countries. And that just like made my day. because I was like, we've been rolling back on various sort of environmental policies, but this has just gone live and I didn't even know they were building it. And that's really cool.
And that's so fun because I stumbled on a map of all these new connects being built across Europe, both for sustainability reason, also for security reason after the Russian aggression against Ukraine and all the energy issue that it raised. And that was mind-blowing that there are already a lot being built and even more being planned. And as you say, that's just perfect. It's sharing energy and low carbon energy as much as you can. So I really love it. I think I will try to find the map and put it in.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for sharing it. That made my day as well. Super cool. So it was great. I will put all the references in the show notes as usual. And what is also super cool that there is like a very good deal of chance that we will meet in London in September. So thanks for joining. Talk to you soon. Keep up this amazing work with a very open source technology carbon standard and sustainable Copilot ID. I love it. So let's stay in touch. Thanks a lot for joining and have a very nice and sustainable day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to this Green.io episode. If you enjoyed it, share it and give us 5 stars on Apple or Spotify. We are an independent media relying solely on you to get more listeners. Plus, it will give our little team Jill, Mabel, Taney and I a noise booster. In our next episode, we will talk about carbon-aware computing. It seems to be the no-brainer action for every CTO or head of cloud ops to decarbonize their tech stack, and yet, benefits at micro level and the impact at scale might not be that well aligned. To discuss it, we will welcome 2 veterans of our show and 2 veterans in green coding as well. Hannah Smith, CEO of the Green Web Foundation, and Ismael Velasco, founder of the Adora Foundation. Stay tuned. By the way, Green.io is a podcast and much more. Visit greenio.tech to subscribe to our free monthly newsletter, read the latest articles on our blog, and check the conferences we organize across the globe. The next one is in Singapore on April 18th, and you can get a free ticket using the voucher Green.io VIP. Looking forward to meeting you there to help you, dear responsible technologists, build a greener digital world, one byte at a time.